Welcome to JTV. In 2017, Sarah Halimi, a French Jew, was murdered in her apartment by her neighbour. He stormed the apartment, shouted Allahu Akbar and threw her off her balcony. As he died, he shouted, "I killed the Satan." The government hesitated in calling the attack anti-Semitic, and in 2019, the murderer was declared to not be criminally responsible because he consumed cannabis before the attack. The decision was appealed, and just recently they announced that they would uphold the ruling, which has led to protests in France and across the world. Today we're joined by Brendan O'Neill, editor of Spiked Online, and Rudy Rochman, a vocal Jewish activist fighting anti-Semitism and standing up for the Jewish people's ancient connection to the land of Israel. Brendan, I'll start with you first. In your recent article for Spiked Online, which I implore all of you to read, and we are going to have a link to this at the bottom, you talked about the Sarah Halimi case and you contrasted it with other cases of anti-Semitism in France. For context, can you give a bit more about this and tell us how France reacted to each of these cases, please?
Yeah, it's a really shocking case. So it's caused a huge controversy in France. There were very large protests across France a week or so ago, with people calling for justice for Sarah and calling for someone to be held to account for the awful crime committed against her, and for recognition that this is part of a pattern in France, a depressing pattern of violent anti-Semitism. There have been numerous shocking acts of violent anti-Semitism over the past few years, and I think France needs to have a more honest reckoning with why that's happening and what can be done about it.
Thanks, Brendan. You mentioned that it's a pattern of anti-Semitism in France. I know, Rudy, you actually lived in France. Could you talk a bit more about your experiences of anti-Semitism in France, their pattern of anti-Semitism?
Sure. Anti-Semitism is usually, there's a formula for it: to find the source of suffering and pain of a society or community and find a way to attach that to the Jewish people. And so this person, although he does not represent all of Islam and many people who are Muslim, there are billions of Muslims and many of them are great people, he did find a way to attach the problems within his own ideology, the shaitan, the Satan, the devil, and attached it to the Jewish people, which is very similar to all forms of anti-Semitism. But I would say that the main problem in France is less so the xenophobic movements that exist on the outskirts of society that tend to make actions, because you will always have xenophobic actions against minority communities in all societies. Until we have what the Jews and the Christians believe as the Messiah, the world will always be imperfect, and so you'll always have individuals. The real problem is, what do those communities themselves do about it? How do they make sure that the society recognizes what is right, what is wrong, and how does the society react when it happens? I was born in France. Both my parents were born in France. My grandparents on my mother's side came to France as refugees from Morocco and Algeria. On my father's side, they came as refugees during the Holocaust from Poland and Belgium. But I left France at the age of 3. I cannot say that I was raised in France, but going there every single summer, having secondhand experiences of my family, I can tell you that there's a very deep problem of anti-Semitism, but there's also a problem of a limitation of reaction from the Jewish community. Whenever I'd go visit my grandparents, they always tell me, put your Magen David inside. And I didn't know how to respond to it as a young child. I refused to do so, but I didn't know how to put words to it. But with time, I understand that when we put our Magen Davids inside, we're basically accepting a reality that the society is meant to persecute us, and we're accepting it. Now, I'm not saying that we should go out and find a group of neo-Nazis in an alleyway and put an Israel flag on their face. But if the Jewish people themselves don't stand up for their own rights, don't create coalitions, don't expose anti-Semitism, don't allow the society to recognize, and from the bottom up, not only from the top down, not only from politicians and from organizations and from businesses and from lawmakers, but also from pop culture. If we cannot express who we are and why we have a right to be respected and treated equally, then we should expect this to continue to happen. Now, my biggest problem is less what happened to Sarah Halimi, that's horrible, but how it's only going to continue to happen, because the reaction of the Jewish people is usually put your heads down. I went to France this summer, and this summer I can't tell you how many times the Jewish community told me not to go to college campuses and defend Israel's right to exist and talk about the Jewish people. And I'm not here pushing a left-wing, right-wing politics. I'm not here to support a political party or any sort of thing. I'm here to talk about the fact that the Jewish people are real people connected to the land of Israel. We have a right to self-determination. We should have conversation on being able to move forward. And the chants that I heard is unlike in America, where they're only trying to criticize Zionism and shield that to cover their anti-Semitism. But I was hearing Moro Juif even this summer on campuses saying, we want death to the Jews. So I think what we're seeing now with actions is a sort of little window to the reality that exists within the pop culture of a society. And we have to deal with that because, as a statement, the Jewish people have always said after the Holocaust, never again. But it's not by saying it that it doesn't happen again. It's by making sure every generation that we make sure that it doesn't happen again. And so I put more responsibility in the Jewish communities that they have to rise up, defend who they are, communicate to the pop culture, make things clear what is right and what is wrong in order for us to move forward.
Thank you, Rudy. I mean, I was in France, I think in 2016 for the Euro football tournament. I remember walking in Paris to a kosher restaurant with my kippah on, and a Jewish person with a baseball cap came and said, take it off, it's not safe here. And coming from London, where I haven't experienced that, I was like, no way, you're crazy. As I was walking, people were shouting abuse at me, so it really resonates with me. And I want to come back to that call for action in a second, and we're going to come back to that at the end. Just one thing I want to mention still on the source of anti-Semitism. Brendan, in your article, which again I implore everyone to read, you talk about the privileged and the oppressed, and I have a quote here which I think is fantastic. It says, Jews are abandoned to preserve the orthodoxies of identitarianism. Could you expand a bit on this, please? Because I think that was quite a powerful message.
Yeah, so I can't speak to the kind of thing that Rudy has just talked about, and Jews in France. I'm not Jewish and I've never lived in France, but he gives a very good description, I think, of a serious problem there. But what I am very aware of is how other sections of society also turn away from the problem of anti-Semitism and refuse to see it as a serious form of racism. And you particularly see this among the left and progressives, so-called progressives, many of whom either subscribe to a modern form of anti-Semitism, a kind of socialism of fools, a critique of capitalism gone horribly wrong, where they start to blame Jews for puppeteering society, for running the banks, for ruining people's lives, that tendency of radical left-wing politics to sometimes veer into the socialism of fools, that has come back on sections of the left today. We saw it with the Corbynista movement in the UK, and there's lots of it across Europe as well. So on the left, there is a problem of anti-Semitism. We're all aware of that. But even amongst sections of the left where there isn't a pronounced problem of anti-Semitism, there is still a reluctance to grapple with anti-Semitism in society. And it is always treated less seriously than other forms of racism. It's treated less seriously than anti-Black racism, anti-Asian racism, anti-Muslim bigotry. All those forms of prejudice which undoubtedly exist are treated as more important, and anti-Semitism is seen as something we just would rather not talk about. It's an inconvenience, and people find it confusing and difficult. And that's really problematic, because I think that essentially gives a green light to anti-Semites. They know that they will never be called out in the same way that other prejudiced people are. They know that there are sections of society that will make excuses for their behavior. They will say things like, well, if Israel wasn't doing the things it's doing, then Jews in Europe wouldn't be suffering from racist abuse. I mean, there are sadly many, many people in society who are willing to make excuses for anti-Jewish hatred. And the reason I wrote that piece about, and I brought in the problem of identity politics, is because I think contemporary identity politics plays a key role in stoking anti-Semitism. I think anti-Semitism in Europe right now is made up of various different threads. There's the old traditional anti-Semitism, that kind of obsessive view of Jewish people as controllers of the world, as a menace, as evil. There's the socialism of fools, as I say, a kind of old left-wing view of Jews as the puppeteers of capitalist society. But then there's also the contribution of identity politics. And what identity politics does, it organizes society according to whether you are oppressed or privileged. Now, lots of this is just made up. You know, the idea, for example, that all white men are privileged is a complete fantasy. Some white men live in extreme poverty. Other white men are very wealthy. So their categories don't make sense to begin with. And Jews are seen as privileged. They're seen as the embodiment of whiteness. They're seen as Jews apparently have a hyper form of white privilege. And so as a consequence of that, sections of the left and sections of the identitarian left come to see Jewish people as a bit of a problem. And it makes no sense to them. The problem of Muslim anti-Semitism, which is growing in Europe. I completely agree with Rudy that this does not mean all Muslims are anti-Semites, and this does not mean all Muslims are a problem. The majority of Muslims just want to get on with their lives as best they can. But there is a problem of Muslim anti-Semitism, and it is particularly pronounced in France. And that doesn't compute for the modern identitarian left, because in their view, Jews are privileged. So it doesn't make sense, and they don't want to talk about it. So all these different political factors, I think, are contributing to the new anti-Semitism. And the new anti-Semitism is going to get worse until we address these underlying causes.
Thank you. I know you touched upon the fact that it's not limited to France, and you both mentioned it's not limited to the Sarah Halimi case. This is just like it's a symptom of something which runs much deeper and is a lot more malicious than just a one-off case. I was wondering, I know you mentioned a quick call to action there, Rudy, but from both of your perspectives, what can be done? I mean, it's really good having protests and all these different things, but what can be done when the High Court in France rules that someone who smoked a bit of weed before committing an anti-Semitic act, isn't responsible for their acts? Is protests enough? I mean, what can be done to change a government in that respect?
Well, first we have to understand the problem, and I think Brendan kind of described the problem. Once upon a time, when we looked at right-wing anti-Semitism back when the Nazis took power, it wasn't something that was identified right away as wrong as it is today. We see it as now today classic anti-Semitism. Back then, it wasn't something as aware that the society was to condemn that. Today, when we have anti-Semitism on the left, the society is kind of ambiguous, doesn't really understand it, doesn't really reject it, and hopefully in the future they will be able to see it, just as they saw right-wing anti-Semitism. And when you see it, every single form of extreme group within every society tends to blame the Jew. That's the one thing that they all agree on. The white supremacists blame the Jews, the Black Hebrew Israelite, Black supremacists blame the Jews, the far right blames the Jews for being the communists, the far left blames the Jews for being the capitalists. And this is something that really exists in society, is finding the Jew and placing them as the enemy of whatever story, of whatever movie that an individual is living in, whatever struggles that they're in, place the Jew as the problem. Now, the left is something that is very relevant today that most people are shutting their eye on. Now, I'm not on the right, I'm not on the left, but there is a problem on the extreme right and on the extreme left. And today, those that control the intellectual spaces, the college campuses, the future political class of the next generation are those on the left. And what do? Like Brendan says, using identity politics, they use intersectionality. So they find the source of suffering of the people of color, of the Native Americans, of the people from the LGBTQ plus community, of women, of Muslims, of every single minority group on a college campus or in an intellectual space. And they find their suffering and they attach that to the same thing that the Jewish people are doing to others, or that Israel is doing to the Palestinians. And they go even further and they say, oh, actually, Israel and the Jewish people are doing this and are responsible for the suffering that those communities go through as well. And that's how they're actually trying to convince the next generation of how the Jewish people / Israel are the problem of the world. Now, you said, what can we do about it? Well, first of all, we have to understand and be able to respond to these things. The Jewish people are not white, because white is not only about a skin color. Right? There are people that are albino in Africa and have very pale skin and are not white. And there are people that are Asian with very pale skin and they're not Caucasian. So white is beyond just its skin color. It's an origin, being originally from Europe, and it is a status of being considered white in a society. The Jewish origin, even with the Ashkenazi experience, which are usually the more predominantly white-looking Jews, their DNA actually comes from the Middle East. So A, we don't come from Europe, and B, even while we were living in Europe for thousands of years, we were never treated as European. We were not allowed to own land. We were not allowed to participate in agrarianism. We were killed by 6 million very recently for not being white. So it's very important to understand that the Jewish people, even those that may be white passing, are not white. And even the conversation of white passing is a very nuanced conversation. When you have a name like David Goldman on a list, and Josh Smith happens to be Black, and David Goldman happens to be a Jew, to the person that's a white supremacist, the person that's white passing on this list is the name Josh Smith and not David Goldman. So the conversation of white passing is very nuanced, and we have to be able to understand it. And yes, sometimes Jews are white passing, but many Jews wear kippah and wear Magen David and wear something that shows that they're Jewish, which their white passing element goes away within 1 second. Now, once we understand who the Jewish people are and what the problem is, we have to communicate and we have to do things from the bottom up. Now, the Sarah Halimi case, where judges actually passed and said that because this person smoked cannabis, not drugs that altered how you act or what you behave, It's something that I think everyone, a majority of people in society have tried cannabis. Everyone knows that this is not something that makes someone want to kill another human being. So it's a ridiculous argument to make. But this is a symptom of the deeper problem that the society does not recognize that the Jewish people should be respected, does not care when something happens against the Jewish people. And so we have to have long-term strategies in order to shift the pop culture, not just to try to put pressure and to redefine anti-Semitism and to pass and try to make lawmakers to change things. That can happen too, but we really need to have grassroots change from the ground up. Now, if we look at other communities, for example, within the United States, you go back 50, 60, 70 years ago, Black people did not have equal rights. Women did not have equal rights. And so how do we go from point A to point B? Granted, there's still a lot of things that need to change within America in order to get to point C, to really have justice and so on. But we got from point A to point B. And how do we do that? Well, Black people and women stood up for themselves. They fought for their rights. They got the pop culture, the younger generations, to recognize that segregation was not okay, that racism was not okay, that sexism was not okay. And eventually, either the politicians had to fulfill what the population wanted, or the politicians themselves came from those groups that grew up in a society that recognized that this was what is right and this is what is wrong. And eventually those policies reflected what the society and what the pop culture was. So we need to have long-term ambitions to change the way pop culture sees things and to make society recognize, first of all, what is a Jew? Who are we? What is our experience? And what is anti-Semitism? What is right and what is wrong? And I also, again, I'm going to put the emphasis on it's important for the Jewish people to rise up. Because when you go to a college campus today, like the ones that I went to at Columbia University in New York City, which is a very liberal school, was listed as one of the most anti-Semitic schools in the world, and you have someone saying something that is racist or sexist, every single Black student and every single student that isn't Black will stand up and fight against that. But when someone says something against the Jews, most Jewish students just put their heads down and don't know what to say, let alone the other students, which definitely won't stand up and put their necks on the line for us. So if we want to change something, yes, we need to have allies, but it's up to us to be able to lead our movement forward and to have society to recognize who we are and why we should be respected.
Wow, it's powerful. I often find myself that Jewish people who are marginalized and have experienced anti-Semitism often, for some reason, have this victim mentality. We don't want to stand up for ourselves. We feel that, sometimes people think it's, we deserve it, and there needs to be a shift. Brendan, I mean, it might be a bit of a strange analogy, but recently with I'm sure you heard about the European Super League with football. For context, 12 of the largest football teams in the world decided to break away and join this crazy Super League, which would make their owners a whole load of money. And all the fans started boycotting and started, having, as you said, Rudy, a grassroots change, and the plans were dropped. Brendan, what do you think can be done on a grassroots level to achieve similar results to that?
I think Rudy makes some really important points there. I think Jews are standing up for themselves, many of them do, of course, but I think more of that would be great. More Jewish movements, self-defense movements, movements that promote that argue against anti-Semitism and promote a greater understanding of Jewish history and Jewish culture, that would be great. The other thing I'm interested in is where the solidarity for that will come from in the rest of society. So I think one possible reason that Jewish people perhaps don't speak up as much as they might is, I think, because of an instinctive recognition that they won't get the support from other people. So if you imagine being on a campus, for example, and I've spoken to many young Jewish people on British campuses who do suffer from anti-Semitism. They experience it regularly. And one question they ask is, well, who can I turn to? The student union is not interested in anti-Semitism. They don't take it seriously. Some of them in the student union might be anti-Semitic themselves. The left on campus is not interested. They're too obsessed with attacking Zionism and hating Israel. They do not want to talk about Jewish problems or anti-Semitism. And sometimes even lecturers, we know that there are lecturers and professors in the UK and other countries who hold problematic views and sometimes borderline anti-Semitic views. So I think one of the problems is the question of who Jewish people can turn to for support or who they can speak to about these problems. And I think sometimes they recognize that there will be a lack of empathy in response to what they are experiencing. So I think building on from what Rudy said, I think at the same time, we need to have a broader movement in society which recognizes the seriousness of anti-Semitism, recognizes that it is getting worse, unfortunately, and recognizes where it comes from, what it represents, and why it's so poisonous. And the more that we can do that, the better. But I really do think the starting point for all of this is to make a huge fuss when there is an anti-Semitic attack, or when there is an act of anti-Semitism, or when someone says something anti-Semitic. We've got to stop just turning away or treating it as normal or refusing to make a big deal out of it. I mean, when I speak to people about the anti-Semitic attacks in France in recent years, they often have no idea that they happened. They have no idea that a school child was shot in the face in France and killed. They don't know that that happened. They have forgotten about the kosher supermarket siege. You know, everyone remembers the Charlie Hebdo massacre, but they've forgotten about the anti-Semitic siege that accompanied it. So they just aren't aware of this stuff because there is such a reluctance to take this form of racism seriously. So I think the starting point has got to be calling this stuff out all the time, standing up to it whenever we experience it or hear about it, and then creating a movement, as Rudy says, of Jewish people who can feel more confident, and a movement of others who are willing to offer them solidarity in the broader crusade against racism.
Thank you so much. That's very powerful, and I wanted to thank you both for your time today. I think we covered off quite a lot, and hopefully our words will become actions and will have a real impact on the ground and beyond. So thank you so much for your time, and hopefully have you guys back on soon.